bipartisan work on this committee. I thank Senator Toomey and especially Senator Crapo, who was chair when I was ranking up until this year. We were able to make important progress holding countries like Russia and North Korea accountable. Senator Toomey and I have worked together to pass tough new fentanyl sanctions to help stem the flow of illegal opioids from China and Mexico that have taken such a toll. Another heartbreaking story on the public radio today about what's happened to far too many families in this country. I'm confident we'll be able to build on the progress we've made this year in conjunction with President Biden and Deputy Secretary Adeyemo. 2 weeks ago in this committee, we explored the economic and humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, as Senator Toomey asked us to, the role of sanctions and how we can get more aid to the Afghan people without resources falling into the hands of the Taliban. Last week, a broad coalition of countries agreed to substantially increase aid to Afghanistan. We continue to work with allies to ensure that aid can be delivered effectively to the people there despite sanctions against the Taliban. Today, we'll focus primarily on the findings and recommendations of the months-long sanctions policy review that Secretary Yellen, Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, and others in Treasury House, they directed the Treasury Department to undertake. The department consulted with agencies across the government, state, commerce, the intelligence community, and others, as well as an array of private sector actors, including banks, businesses, nonprofits, international NGOs, and sanctions experts. That comprehensive review examined important questions of our current sanctions policy. Does the U.S. government have the right sanctions tools? Are we using them effectively with allies? Are we reassessing their application and adapting them as we go? Are we targeting the right people, the right entities, the right countries in the right way with the right sanctions? Ultimately, are we actually changing the behavior of targeted countries, entities, or people, where that's obviously our goal? I know that Treasury has recommendations on these other questions. There's some guiding bipartisan principles that this committee's recognized for years regarding sanctions, and let me just briefly outline those. Number one, we should impose sanctions on a multilateral basis whenever possible. They're more effective. They garner broader political and diplomatic support if we impose them in coordination with allies. Number two, preserving, strengthening humanitarian exceptions and licensing are important to ensure that people don't suffer from shortages of food and medicine and other necessities because of the sanctions. Number three, for sanctions to be effective, they must have clear targets and goals and objectives. If we're trying to change countries and other actors' behavior, they need to understand how, once they do better, they can free themselves from sanctions. Fourth, the U.S. must do a better job of regularly assessing the effectiveness of sanctions. We need to communicate those findings better to banks and other entities that are implementing the sanctions policy. And last, the executive branch must continue to support and empower the dedicated public servants across the government charged with implementation and enforcement. As with any job, workers are our greatest assets, whether at Treasury, at State, on the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, or in the Intelligence Committee in our government. They must have the funding, the analytical tools, the technical expertise, including in cryptocurrencies, as we've discussed, which need a much closer look. They need the technology and the time to do their jobs, particularly as we've increased the use of sanctions around the world. Today's hearing will give members a chance to survey other international policy issues within our jurisdiction and pose any questions to the Deputy Secretary, which I'm sure he is prepared to address. I thank Deputy Secretary Adeyemo for your work on these issues. I look forward to your testimony. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, welcome back. Under President Biden, the Treasury Department has advanced a number of troubling international policies, some of which are clearly intended to circumvent the will of Congress. Let's take sanctions to start with. The administration has offered sanctions relief to some of our adversaries in the unrealistic hope that they'll make concessions inimical to their very nature. Consider Iran, for instance. To entice Iran to re-enter the flawed JCPOA, the administration appears willing to lift sanctions on Iran. Then the administration hopes that Iran will commit to cease supporting terrorism and to curb its ballistic missiles program. But let's be clear. Once sanctions are lifted, Iran will never limit its malign behavior. The administration clearly intends to repeat the mistakes of the Obama administration and re-enter a treaty with Iran despite bipartisan opposition and without Senate approval. In addition, the administration has repeatedly failed to comply with mandatory sanctions laws. Also, let's look at Iran. Since President Biden was elected, according to the International Energy Agency, Iran has doubled the amount of crude oil it's selling to China to 600,000 barrels each day this year. Even though these sales are illegal under sanctions laws, the administration has refused to impose congressionally required sanctions on the Chinese buyers. Take the case of Russia. The administration has also chosen to ignore a law requiring sanctions on Russia's Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The pipeline's project manager has been using sanctioned Russian entities to construct and finance Nord Stream 2, meaning that the manager's integral role in the pipeline is predicated on a massive sanctions evasions campaign. Congress passed the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CATSA, to punish, among other things, this very type of conduct, sanctions evasion. Congress did this because sanctions evasion harms U.S. national security interests, and in this instance, it's increasing Putin's malign influence over Europe. But the administration continues to violate this statute in order to give Putin a pass. Take the OECD tax agreement. As if all this weren't enough, the administration is trying now to enact an international tax treaty that will harm U.S. competitiveness, and to do it without obtaining the necessary two-thirds approval of the Senate. You will recall the tax increase consists of two pillars. Pillar one is an unprecedented treaty change that would allow foreign countries to tax American companies based on the American company's sales overseas. It's a big tax revenue transfer from us to them. Unsurprisingly, this is the priority for other countries who've long sought this tax transfer. Pillar two is a 15% global minimum tax on multinationals' foreign income. Now, this is the administration's attempt to justify the huge tax increase it wants to impose on U.S. companies. Unsurprisingly, this is the administration's priority, since it's an integral part of dismantling the successful 2017 tax reforms. But by imploring other countries to implement a global minimum tax that will harm their own workers and businesses, the administration has implicitly acknowledged that their proposed multinational tax increase will make U.S. workers and businesses less competitive if other countries either don't implement a global minimum tax of their own or implement a significantly lower rate than what the administration is proposing. But here's a problem. There's a very real possibility that other countries will not implement the global minimum tax. They've only reluctantly agreed to that global minimum tax as a condition, in return for getting Pillar 1, the U.S. tax revenue transferred to them. But as I say, implementing Pillar 1 requires two-thirds approval in the Senate, and I don't think that's going to happen. So the administration is either going to impose its own global minimum tax increase on American companies anyway, without the countries we compete with having enacted a corresponding tax increase, or they're going to violate the Constitution by modifying our existing tax treaties without obtaining the two-thirds consent of the Senate. Let's turn quickly to the FSOC Climate Risk Report. This is the latest troubling international policy proposal from the administration. We expect this report to come out soon. It's likely to claim that global warming poses a systemic risk to the financial system. Now, I acknowledge that global warming is real. However, it does not follow from this that there's a new systemic risk to the financial system. We have had severe weather events since the dawn of time. And as the economist John Cochrane has explained to this committee, major weather events, and I quote, have never come close to causing a systemic financial crisis, end quote. And there's no scientifically validated possibility to change this in the near future. Our Democratic colleagues should acknowledge this reality and offer their proposals on climate change through the legislative process, which they're doing, including calling for a carbon tax, in which this very dangerous tax and spend measure they're contemplating will make energy prices higher. But that legislative approach is not enough for our Democratic colleagues. They also want to use the unaccountable financial regulators to really misuse their power and essentially cut off the supply of capital to fossil fuel companies. Well, all across America, we're already seeing what happens when the regulatory environment discourages the development of necessary energy sources. Energy prices spike. This dynamic will only get much worse if financial regulators are pressured to starve the energy sector of the capital it needs to provide America the energy that we all need. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, I look forward to discussing these issues with you today.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Wally Adeyemo was sworn in as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury in March of 2021. He spent the majority of his career in public service convening governments and companies and organizations to move toward achieving common goals. He came to the Treasury Department from the Obama Foundation, where he served as president beginning August 2019. He served as a senior advisor before that at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and at BlackRock. He held a number of roles in public service before this. He holds a BA from the University of California at Berkeley and a JD from Yale Law School. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, it's good to have you here. Welcome. Please begin.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee, thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak to you today about the National Advisory Council on International Monetary and Financial Policies report to Congress, the Treasury Department's priorities, and our outlook for the global financial system. As you know, the international financial institutions form the core of the international financial architecture that is consistent with our economic interest. It is no accident that the U.S. economy is the largest in the world, that our financial markets are the deepest and most liquid, and that the dollar is the world reserve currency. Our economic success is the result of the policy choices we made coming out of World War II, alongside the hard work and determination of the American people. America's interest in a strong, stable, and rules-based economic order is also deeply entwined with our foreign policy and national security interest. Our economic objectives cannot succeed if the international financial system facilitates the illicit flow of funds to oppressive regimes, terrorist groups, cyber criminals, and other malign actors. Bearing this in mind, Secretary Yellen requested a review of Treasury's use of financial and economic sanctions since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. The review identified 4 primary challenges to the continued effectiveness of our sanctions regime. 1, our adversaries' attempts to build payment systems that allowed them to avoid the dollar-based financial system. 2, technological changes like the growth of digital currencies. 3, the need to permit the flow of legitimate humanitarian assistance and avoid collateral impact on non-target populations. And finally, 4, ensuring that sanctions are always deployed alongside other measures as part of an overarching national security strategy. I want to briefly describe to the committee the 5 initiatives Treasury is advancing to respond to these challenges and modernize the use of sanctions. 1, adopting a policy framework. Treasury will adopt the use of a structured policy framework in order to inform its recommendations on the use of sanctions. This framework will seek to ensure that sanctions support clear policy objectives within a broad strategy, reflect input from technical experts and other critical sources of information, including the intelligence community, incorporates multilateral cooperations, and are easily understood, enforceable, and reversible. The framework will be a true tool to improve the use of sanctions, not a means to prevent it. 2, improving access to humanitarian assistance. Treasury will work to expand sanctions exceptions where appropriate to support the flow of legitimate humanitarian assistance, incorporating lessons learned from the last 20 years. The department is committed to consistently providing clear guidance in the context of all applicable sanctions regimes, including the continued flow of legitimate humanitarian aid to heavily sanctioned jurisdictions. 3, regular assessment of sanctions program. Treasury plans to use the sanctions policy framework on a regular basis to review sanctions programs and authorities and make recommendations to augment, adapt, or wind down individuals' authorities, or to list or delist particular entities. 4, improve sanctions coordination and communication. The threat of sanctions alone, not even the imposition, remains a powerful tool of economic statecraft. In order to calibrate the use of this tool, Treasury needs to communicate and coordinate more effectively with stakeholders affected by the use of financial sanctions. This includes U.S. allies and partners, financial institutions, and other actors within the financial system, nonprofit organizations, and the media. We will do this by using existing forums where we meet with our allies and partners to coordinate and collaborate on sanctions, as well as build a more formal mechanism for receiving feedback and advice and providing information to stakeholders. 5, we plan to modernize our operational capabilities. As the threats to our nations change, sanctions must also adapt. Treasury must invest in changes to its workforce and technical capabilities to meet these evolving threats. This will involve streamlining current functions, as well as making workforce and infrastructure investments to take on growing threats like ransomware and other cybercrime. This effort will require building on current processes in some areas and changes in others. Certain changes may be implemented in the near term, while others will require further deliberation and analysis to determine the best path forward in collaboration with the State Department and other executive branch partners. In many cases, support and advice from key partners like Congress will be critical. Members, sanctions are not only an important tool of the United States, they play an important role in maintaining the rules-based global economy, which has benefited the world for generations. I look forward to working with members of this committee to continue advancing U.S. international economic leadership abroad and creating opportunities for Americans at home. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary. Well, you've laid out, your staff's put a lot of time and work in this. You've laid out general principles and recommendations. What are the most important and urgent findings and recommendations, and will any of them require congressional approval?
Thank you, Senator, and I want to thank you and your staff and the staff of this committee for spending a great deal of time with those of us at Treasury talking about the sanctions review. As you will see from the report and also from my testimony this morning, the findings we have largely align with the principles this committee has outlined. The key for us is making sure that as we think about sanctions on a go-forward basis, we're making the investments today to keep up with innovations, not only technology, but innovations by our adversaries that are attempting to bypass our sanctions. This will require us to do more multilaterally. Frankly, by doing more multilaterally, put ourselves in a place where when we decide to act unilaterally, we have greater power in terms of our ability to affect change, the change of behavior, which is the ultimate goal of sanctions. We're going to need to work with Congress to advance things like creating the type of opportunities within the executive branch to hire staff who understand issues like crypto going forward, so looking to Congress to help us with hiring authorities. The President's FY22 budget includes additional resources which will allow us to build on the technological expertise that we need in the Treasury Department, and will also help us bring on the type of workforce we need to ensure that we're able to meet these challenges going forward. A great deal of the work that we need to do will need to happen with our executive branch colleagues, but we look forward to also working with Congress to advance these important goals.
Thank you. The importance of your strikes me as this review is especially important because the last time U.S. sanctions were reviewed comprehensively was 20 years ago. It resulted in the enactment of a new law requiring exclusion of trade in agriculture and medicine and medical products from sanctions. Clearly, we need to work harder to avoid collateral consequences of sanctions on humanitarian and on humanitarian aid. So my question is this, especially as the pandemic continues to put all of us at risk as variants mutate around the globe, what specific new steps are you recommending that Treasury take to mitigate the harm to humanitarian aid efforts?
Senator, it's critical that, especially in areas where sanctions are used, humanitarian assistance is able to continue to flow. We've learned a great deal from what we've done over the last 20 years. You'll see that some of that has been applied to some of the sanctions programs that we've introduced recently. For example, the President's executive order with regard to actions occurring in Ethiopia. When we issued that executive order, we also put out general licenses at the same time to ensure that humanitarian assistance would continue to flow. One of the challenges that we have is that we often will announce sanctions programs and then wait to hear from humanitarian groups before we then issue guidance to provide them with the ability to continue to flow humanitarian assistance into these areas. Our goal now needs to be to ensure that we take the lessons we've learned from the last 20 years and ensure that humanitarian assistance can be provided alongside our sanctions programs in order to meet the needs of people who are suffering in these areas, especially during this moment of COVID. Ensuring that medicine and food can get to these affected people is not only consistent with our values, but it will help us end the pandemic globally.
A number of critics have argued that the sort of clumsy use or the overuse of sanctions, of unilateral sanctions by the U.S., especially during the Trump administration, played into the hands of our adversaries. How concerned are you about efforts by China and Russia and others to insulate themselves from U.S. sanctions, including by moving away from dollarized transactions, creating new financial messaging systems or taking other similar efforts? Do you view these efforts, if they were to persist and intensify, as posing a threat to the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency?
Senator, my view is that the U.S. dollar as the world reserve for currency will remain for a number of reasons, including the fact that we've made the needed investments in America. Ultimately, people are going to want to invest in America and do business here because of the strength of our economy and the openness of our system and the certainty of our laws. But it is true that if we do not use sanctions appropriately, it will drive not only our adversaries, but a number of others to look for ways around the use of the dollar in their financial dealings. Our goal then needs to be to make sure that we do two things. One is that in using our sanctions, we need to use a framework that's consistent with the principles, frankly, that this committee has been outlining for a long time. But in addition to doing that, we need to try and multilateralize our sanctions whenever possible. While it's hard to avoid being engaged in financial transactions that avoid the dollar, it's even harder to avoid financial transactions that avoid the dollar, the euro, the pound, and the yen. That's why it's critical that more often we try and do things multilaterally with our allies and partners going forward.
Thank you. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, I can't help but note the irony of your discussing how and why it is so important that we preserve the ability to implement a sanctions regime in the future when you and the administration choose not to implement sanctions that statute currently requires. Let's take the case of Iranian oil sales to China. The Iran Freedom and Counterproliferation Act, IFCA, prohibits the purchase of Iranian oil. Yet, according to the International Energy Agency's satellite data, since January of this year, China's been importing around 600,000 barrels of Iranian oil per day. And the administration knows it. On September 28th, Reuters reported that, and I quote, a senior U.S. official said, "We are aware of the purchases that Chinese companies are making of Iranian oil," end quote. Now, I'm sure you acknowledge that IFCA requires sanctions on purchasers of Iranian oil, right?
Senator, the law does require
Okay.
sanctioning on the purchase.
And you acknowledge that Chinese companies are buying Iranian oil in very significant quantities, right?
Senator, I'm aware that a number of people are attempting to buy Iranian oil, and our goal is to make sure that
Okay, but we're not talking about attempts. It is a factual matter that Chinese entities are routinely, daily, buying hundreds of thousands of barrels of Iranian oil in direct violation of our sanctions regime, right?
Senator, we continue to monitor purchases of Iranian oil, and we look forward to using
Okay, so you're making my point. I'm going to submit a written question, and for the sake of time, I'd appreciate a written answer as to why it is that you believe that the mandatory nature of this sanctions statute is somehow optional, because it's actually not. And we all know that this is going on. Let's move on to Nord Stream 2. So since early July, several other senators and I have been very concerned that the administration is again violating the statute by not sanctioning the project manager of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, that is Nord Stream 2 AG, under Section 228 of CATSA. And here's the problem. Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, the whole project is riddled with sanctioned Russian entities, ranging from the project owner to various contractors, vessels, certain employees. They're all subject to sanctions, already established sanctions. The case of Gazprom illustrates why the Treasury Department is violating this law. The Obama administration imposed sectoral sanctions, or SSI sanctions, on Gazprom due to Russia's efforts to destabilize eastern Ukraine. Now, yeah, I'm sure you don't dispute that Gazprom is currently subject to SSI sanctions, right?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. So CATSA Section 228 goes after entities facilitating sanctions evasions on behalf of, and I quote, any person subject to sanctions imposed by the United States with respect to the Russian Federation, end quote. On OFAC, that is to say the Treasury's own website, answer to FAQ number 546 explicitly makes it clear that persons subject, I'm quoting now, persons subject to sanctions imposed by the United States with respect to the Russian Federation includes persons listed on the SDN list or the SSI list, end quote. So we've established that Gazprom is a party sanctioned by the U.S. government for the purpose of CATSA 228. So you could ask, okay, so what does that have to do with Nord Stream 2 AG? Well, on its own website, Nord Stream 2 AG describes itself as a project company established by Gazprom for the purpose of planning, construction, and subsequent operation of Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And again, I'm sure you agree that Gazprom did in fact set up Nord Stream 2 AG to construct and operate the pipeline, right?
Senator, we've talked about this issue several times, and I agree with you that we need to do everything we can to implement CATSA. As I've said to you previously, we are currently working with the intelligence community.
I understand, but let me just finish this because this is important and we're going to run out of time. And so we also know that Nord Stream 2 AG has facilitated sanctions evasion for Gazprom. Now you might ask, well, how do we know that? Well, we know this because the State Department has told us this, right? In a May 2021 report, the State Department said that Nord Stream 2 AG has, and I quote, knowingly facilitated deceptive or structured transactions to provide vessels for the construction of Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And Mr. Adeya, I'm sure you'll confirm again that it was in fact Treasury lawyers signed off on the evidentiary package that the State Department used for this determination. So you've acknowledged that Gazprom is sanctioned. You acknowledged that Gazprom set up Nord Stream 2 AG. I believe you've acknowledged that Nord Stream 2 AG has facilitated sanctions evasions. Certainly your lawyers did when the State Department concluded that Nord Stream 2 AG has facilitated sanctions evasions to get vessels involved in this. Do you acknowledge that Nord Stream 2 AG did all this on behalf of Gazprom?
Senator, as I've said, we're committed to working with you in this committee to hold Gazprom responsible for its activities that violate our sanctions.
But you're not answering a direct question here. Do you acknowledge that Nord Stream 2 AG has engaged in the activity that is laid out by the State Department on behalf of Gazprom?
Senator, we support the State Department's report. We work with them on that report. Their report was based on a separate authority than the one that we're talking about today, which is CATSA. With regard to CATSA, we're committed to making sure that we work with you.
Let me just close by saying, look, it's very clear what's going on here. Gazprom created Nord Stream 2 to evade sanctions. That was the entire purpose. Everything around this picture are the sanctioned entities, and they needed Nord Stream 2. They needed an unsanctioned entity in order to bypass the sanctions. That's exactly what we passed CATSA for on a bipartisan basis, and it's completely unacceptable that it's not being implemented.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Senator Tester is recognized for 5 minutes from Montana.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, your testimony highlighted important work of countering China's unfair trade practices. And it is true they are the pacing threat to us in the world today. It's a key focus of mine in the Defense Subcommittee, which I chair. And it's why I pushed so hard to get the bipartisan infrastructure bill across the finish line in the Senate. We'll continue to push to get it across the finish line in the House. But from your perspective, as your role as Deputy Secretary, what is the most effective way to address what China is doing with particularly currency manipulation?
Senator, thank you for the question, and thank you for your work on those important issues. My view is that the most important thing that we can do with regard to competing with China is making the investments in the United States that you've taken a leadership role on, like the infrastructure bill that has passed the Senate and is currently in the House. In terms of the issue of currency manipulation, the President and the Secretary have been very clear that we will not allow any country to unfairly use its currency to push for more exports. As you know, on a semi-annual basis, the Treasury Department puts out a report on foreign exchange intervention that highlights countries that violate the international rules in this area. When it comes to China, we are committed to holding them accountable for all of their unfair actions, both unilaterally in the United States, but also working multilaterally with our allies and our partners, because we know that fundamentally the actions that China take don't only hurt American consumers and American workers, but they hurt the American workers around and consumers around the world.
So let me ask you this. Is there anything that you need from Congress, specifically this committee, any additional authorities?
Senator, at the moment, I think that Congress providing us with the authorities to pull together the foreign exchange report is what we need. We're working actively with the USTR and other agencies within the government to use our tools to hold China and others accountable, and we look forward to continuing to consult with you if there are additional authorities that we need.
Okay. From a standpoint of cryptocurrency, is that changed how the Treasury Department deals with sanctions?
Senator, as we highlighted in the sanctions review, cryptocurrencies has required us to look at ways that we can try to deal with potential sanctions evasions. And we have highlighted this by taking certain actions with regard to crypto actors who are using this means of payment for things like ransomware. It'll require us to also invest more in different parts of our workforce going forward and improving our technology infrastructure.
How often are you seeing cryptocurrencies being used to avoid sanctions?
Senator, we recently put out a report just last week highlighting the use of cryptocurrencies in ransomware to the tune of several $100 million of collections through cryptocurrencies. We recognize that a number of actors who seek to impact our national security are using cryptocurrencies to try and get around our sanctions regimes. In terms of a quantifiable number, we know it's more than several $100 million, and our goal has got to be to try and identify those where it exists and to stop it using the tools that Congress has provided us.
So from your perspective, do you think the cryptocurrency should be a regulated market in a way that's similar to our conventional monetary system?
So, Senator, from my perspective, one of the things that we've benefited from a great deal in the United States is innovation. Innovation has helped drive our economy, and financial innovation has done that. But it's important that as we think about those innovations, we also have a regulatory regime that protects consumers and protects our national security. We're going to need to use the tools like the BSA and AML laws to make sure that we're protecting our national security. But there's also going to be a need to work with Congress to decide on whether we need additional tools in this space as well.
Okay. Last question. You talked about reserve currency quickly, and you talked about the fact that we have it and we're probably not going to lose it. I have a little different perspective, but I want to hear yours. Could you tell me what impact defaulting on the debt might have on our status of reserve currency and the uncertainty that might create?
Senator, as Secretary Yellen has said, a default on the U.S. debt would be catastrophic from the standpoint of our credibility, not only to our creditors, but our credibility in the world, and would have a clear impact on people's trustworthiness in the United States and our ability to meet our commitments.
And so you would see that as a giant step in the wrong direction as far as maintaining our reserve currency status?
Yes, Senator. Ultimately, the reason that the United States dollar is the reserve currency in the world is because people trust the United States economy. They have confidence in the investments and the decisions that we make.
Yeah.
And if we were to not pay our bills on time, it would send ricochets through those people who have confidence in our economy.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Tester. Senator Scott is recognized from South Carolina from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Adeyemo, for being with us today. I have a couple of questions for you. I noticed that Senator Tester started asking questions about the plan to make sure that we don't default on our debt or the consequences of us defaulting on our debt. And without any question, I've read a number of reports that suggest that the plan that was going to be in place to make sure that we didn't default on our debt was already being thought through, wise planning from my perspective. Here's a question, though, that is not related to sanctions, even though I know that we are talking about sanctions, but it would be impossible for me not to ask a question about the current proposals coming out of the administration as it relates to the ability to investigate and or have access to every transaction in every American's banking accounts or financial accounts based on simply $600 of flow coming through. I know that some proposals have $600, others have $10,000. The challenge is whether it's $600 or $10,000, it captures basically the same number of accounts. Ultimately, if someone pays $800 a month in rent, that's $9,600 with any of the transactions, you break the $10,000 threshold. If you are a senior citizen receiving Social Security with the average Social Security check being around $1,500 or $18,000 a year, your financial institution then has to report to the IRS your account. I don't know what in the world the IRS will do with the information that they receive from these financial institutions. I say this with the backdrop of the last Democrat administration. We saw the IRS not peering into, but investigating nonprofit religious organizations and conservative organizations without expanding their power or their reach. So my concern is that as we see this administration's proposal to give more access to the IRS to peer in and investigate, frankly, $600 of flow in and out of accounts of every American, that essentially captures all Americans' transactions in this country. If you're looking for tax cheats, that is a terrible way of figuring it out. But if you are, in fact, looking at a big government proposal to have the ability to investigate every single transaction of a financial institution of your account, my account, and their accounts, well, this might be a good direction to go in. And I would love to hear why you think it's important for every American's transactions to be made available to the IRS.
Senator, thank you for that question because it gives me an opportunity to make clear the president's policy goal, which is to make sure that wealthy taxpayers who are avoiding taxes in this country pay the taxes that they owe. As you know, the top 1% of income earners in this country fail to pay more than $150 billion in taxes each year. And the reason for this is because they don't earn income the same way that most of your constituents do, which is by getting a W-2, which is information that a teacher or a truck driver or any other employee's company provides to them, but also then provides to the IRS. The reality is wealthy people often earn their income through partnerships or other ways in which they can sell an asset for $2 million, put that $2 million in the bank account, and tell the IRS that they only earned $100,000. What the president seeks to do is level the playing field so that wealthy individuals are forced to pay taxes in the same way that working class people do every day in this country. We're committed to
Thank you for your answer. Let me just follow up on your answer, because I do think you raise an important point. And I hope everyone who's watching is listening to what I think is an explanation that requires a little more questions. Let me think of it this way. The top 2% of Americans make about 18 out of every $100, but they pay about 36 out of every $100 in taxation. The 60% of Americans pay no federal taxes. Here's my question. For those 60% that pay no federal taxes, you're literally going to be having the access to investigate their accounts too. So if you're looking to simply find the tax cheats of the top 1% or 2% of Americans, you don't need a threshold of $600. You don't need a threshold of $10,000. Frankly, you don't even need a threshold of $100,000. What this threshold of $600 or $10,000 does, it captures all the information, all the transactions of everyday Americans, not the rich ones, but the ones working paycheck to paycheck should not be forced to have an additional burden on their plates about whether or not the IRS is going to be investigating them, whether or not someone's going to be harassing them. That's not about millionaires and billionaires. That is an actual additional burden on working class Americans. We can do better than that. Thank you for your answer.
Can I just respond quickly?
Senator, Mr. Secretary, of course.
The president's willing to work with Congress on the threshold on ways to protect those who earn W-2s and those who get Social Security payments. Our ultimate goal is making sure that wealthy people who don't pay the taxes that they owe pay those taxes in order to make sure that we have the money to pay for things like infrastructure and child care in this country.
Senator
Well,
Manchin.
Mr. Adeyemo and Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you extending my time to the witness to respond. I will simply say this, that if you're looking for a way to make sure that people pay their fair share of taxes, I got to tell you that this proposal is not in the same universe of accomplishing that goal. This proposal, whether it's $600 or $10,000, if you exclude the Social Security recipients at $1,500, you still have the vast majority of Americans working paycheck to paycheck with an additional burden, with another thing to be concerned about from their government. That is not the way the free market should work. It's certainly not the way that we want our country working, that every single American has to be concerned about the IRS. Those three letters are scary enough without giving them more access to our accounts unnecessarily, especially for working class Americans. Thank you very much for your response.
Senator Menendez is from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, would you agree that sanctions are one of the few peaceful tools of diplomacy?
Senator, I do agree that sanctions are an effective tool of diplomacy that are peaceful.
And I appreciate that the Treasury Department is thinking through how to ensure the sanctions remain an effective tool, but I'm concerned that this review doesn't reflect a holistic approach to sanctions. I mean, I see the Treasury Department as basically as the entity that once an administration decides to pursue sanctions in pursuit of peaceful diplomacy somewhere in the world, is the executor of those sanctions. I think most people would agree that sanctions are a foreign policy tool, but this review is basically a Treasury-centric product that does not address the many sanctions authorities implemented by the State Department and largely pays lip service to the State Department's role in sanctions. At the same time, I get the sense that the State Department often struggles to play an effective role. They don't match up well to Treasury's resources and capacity in this area. So my question to start off is why spend all of this time and effort on a review when it is a single agency product rather than one that is reflective of the overall foreign policy component that should be the driving force, I think, in our sanctions policies?
Senator, I completely agree that sanctions are a tool that are driven by foreign policy decisions that are made and mainly driven by the State Department and the National Security Council. But given the importance of this tool and the use of the tool, we wanted to make sure that we're ensuring that the tool is effective going forward. And we worked closely with the State Department with regard to this report, and we look forward to working closely with them.
Well, let me ask you this. If I don't know how closely you worked, but would you consider a joint effort with State moving forward?
We do plan to a joint effort with State going forward.
Let me ask you, sanctions are only as good as they are enforced, like any other law. If you have a law, if there's a red light and you go through the red light, unless there's the likelihood there'll be an enforcement against you for doing so, you'll go through the red light. Same thing in terms of sanctions in a more significant context. I've raised this before, but I'm deeply concerned that China is continuing to buy from oil in significant quantities from Iranians, both subverting international sanctions and impacting the oil market. I'm disappointed that the United States, and for that fact, the rest of the international community doesn't seem to be holding China accountable for these violations. What steps are you taking to enforce sanctions on China to comply with the law?
Senator, at the Treasury Department, we're committed to complying with the law and to seeking intelligence on the companies and entities that are purchasing illegal oil and to holding them accountable. We're happy to provide you and your staff with a classified briefing on the steps we're taking with regard to those entities.
Well, I appreciate that you're committed to it, but only sanctioning actually makes it relevant at the end of the day, and we're not. This is being done in plain view. I mean, we're talking about millions and millions of barrels of oil that are being purchased by China from Iran in clear view of everyone in the international community. I don't know how much due diligence is ultimately necessary to find out that which is available to the public eye. So I really look forward to hearing what you're going to do in that regard. I also look forward to understanding, for example, Turkey and the S-400. They're talking about making more purchases. When we wrote this law, we wrote it in such a way so that certain actions are mandatory in nature, not discretionary. But yet we have seen both the past administration and this administration not necessarily enforcing the mandatory nature of the sanctions? Why not?
Senator, I'm committed to enforcing mandatory sanctions where we have the proof and evidence to do so. We rely heavily on the Council of Career Lawyers at the Treasury Department, the DOJ, in terms of how that enforcement, and also on the intelligence that we have at hand.
Well, I love lawyers, but they can kill every process in the world. The reality is that I find that Congress's intent is habitually subverted by both the previous administration and so far, in some cases, this administration. Last question, when can we expect to see designations related to the executive order on imposing sanctions on certain persons with respect to the humanitarian and human rights crisis in Ethiopia that was issued by the administration on September 17th?
Senator, we're committed to finding a peaceful resolution to the situation in Ethiopia. And the president has issued an executive order, and we continue to work with parties to bring them to the table, but have made very clear that we're also willing to use that executive order to do so. As the process continues, we will continue to evaluate sanctions targets and are committed to keeping you informed as we do so.
Okay, I appreciate you're very committed, but I have to be honest with you, I don't see the commitment in action. And so I'm looking forward to the action on these and others. I have other questions I'll submit it for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. Senator Daines from Montana is recognized from his office.
Chairman, thank you. And I want to extend a warm welcome to our witness. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss a few matters that are affecting the security of our nation. Over the past year, China has exerted increasing pressure, both militarily as well as financially, on Taiwan and its neighbors in the South China Sea, while at the same time hedging itself from international pressure with new anti-sanctions laws. Mr. Yamayama, how does China's decision not to extend anti-sanctions laws into Hong Kong inform our own strategy for deterring aggression and assuring our allies in the South Pacific?
Senator, thank you for the important question, and I think this speaks to why we believe it's critical that as we move forward on sanctions, we look for at every opportunity the ability to do them multilaterally. Frankly, our adversaries are seeking to find ways around our sanctions every day, and the best way to ensure that they're unable to do that is by making sure that our sanctions are not just driven by the United States, but by the international community made up of our allies and partners. While the economic impact of our sanctions is great, by bringing along our allies and partners, we increase the political impact of isolation, which matters to our adversaries and puts us in a better position to enforce these sanctions over the long term.
Mr. Adeyemo, I agree with you. The multilateral approach is a good approach, and I would encourage you to head in that direction. In addition to these anti-sanction laws, China's main goal in the development of the digital yuan is to establish an alternative to the U.S. financial system and one that is immune to sanctions. How can we ensure that our sanctions policy doesn't risk the centrality of the U.S. dollar as a dollar-based institution and the U.S. payment networks that carry importance that are far beyond the specific country that's being sanctioned?
Senator, again, I think that one of the things we need to do as we think through how to make sure that we further enhance the dollar-based financial system is ensuring that our allies and our partners remain bought into that system by working more with them going forward. In addition to doing that, we need to do many of the things this committee has been calling for a long time in terms of the principles that you've outlined, making sure that when we do use sanctions, we're using them as part of a clearly defined strategy, that we're allowing for humanitarian access to continue to flow. When it comes to a country like China, it is true that they are trying to find means around our financial system to avoid sanctions. But it is difficult for countries, our adversaries, to find a means around not only the U.S. financial system, but the financial systems of our partners and allies as well. Fundamentally, by taking actions in unison with other countries, we put ourselves in a better position mission to make sure that we maintain the dollar-based financial system globally, and also that we're able to hold our adversaries accountable for actions that they take that are in violation of international laws and norms.
Thank you. Speaking of adversaries, just earlier this month, without warning or explanation, the Biden administration lifted sanctions on two Iranian entities involved in the military missile programs, the Mammoet Industrial Group and its subsidiary Mammoet Diesel. This action contradicts earlier assurances by President Biden that he would not ease sanctions until Iran reversed its course on its pursuit of a nuclear weapon. Mr. Adeyemo, why did the administration lift sanctions on these two entities?
Senator, I want to assure you this was not in response to a change in administration policy, but rather in response to legal actions that were taking place. Happy to provide you with a more detailed briefing on those legal actions in another setting.
Of course, it gave us, I think, great concern. And so perhaps a more direct question would be, does the president remain committed to preventing Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon? Or should we expect to see more of these, I think what I would call them quiet concessions?
So, Senator, again, I want to make clear that this was not a concession, but rather in response to a legal action. The president remains committed to ensuring that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. He's made clear that if Iran re-enters the JCPOA, we're willing to take steps in that regard, but not before.
Lastly, on Afghanistan, as the nation continues to deal with the terrible aftermath of President Biden's very abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan, questions remain as to how the U.S. is going to prevent the rise of terrorism and address the growing humanitarian crisis in that nation. Do you foresee a scenario where the United States would relinquish the frozen Afghan central bank reserve to the Taliban?
Senator, I see under no situation in which we would allow the Taliban to have access to the reserves that belong to the Afghan people. We believe that it's essential that we maintain our sanctions against the Taliban, but at the same time find ways for legitimate humanitarian assistance to get to the Afghan people. And that's exactly what we're doing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen of Maryland's recognized for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Adeyemo. Good to see you. And I agree that sanctions are only one tool in our national security and foreign policy toolbox. But as you indicated, they can play an important role in enforcing a rules-based international system. You would agree, would you not, that China grossly violated its international obligations when it cracked down on democracy in Hong Kong?
I agree, Senator.
Right. And while we know that sanctions cannot always succeed in reversing malign conduct, if we raise the costs of those actions, we send a signal that whether it's China or another country, if they want to engage in this kind of aggressive behavior elsewhere, they will pay a price. But that only works if they actually pay a significant price. After China's actions in Hong Kong, the Congress passed legislation. Senator Toomey and I authored legislation, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which requires the executive branch to impose sanctions on officials that are complicit in the crackdown in democracy, and importantly, on financial institutions that help facilitate those individuals. Senator Toomey and I wrote to Secretary Yellen back in June, applauding the administration for sanctioning some individuals, but raising the question about whether or not the administration had been successful in identifying any financial institutions that facilitated those. There have been conversations since, but as of today, is it your testimony that the Department of Treasury cannot identify any financial institutions that facilitate the individuals that you've applied sanctions to?
Senator, as we said then, we have not found financial institutions that facilitate those types of transactions, but it's something we're continuing to look at. I think you made a clear point that one of the goals is to increase the costs of people who take these types of actions. And from our perspective, not only doing this unilaterally, but working with our allies to raise the cost is critically important as well.
Well, let me turn to another piece of legislation that Senator Toomey and I and Senator Brown passed called the Brink Act, which applied sanctions against any financial entities facilitating North Korea's malign activities. And it was modeled after the Iran sanctions legislation. So it was a mandatory and secondary sanctions. To date, despite the fact that a UN group identified lots of financial institutions that they say are helping North Korea evade those sanctions, the administration, neither the previous one or the current administration, the Biden administration, has imposed sanctions on any of these financial institutions since the passage of the Brink Act. Is it your testimony today that we haven't identified any financial institutions that are helping North Korea violate the sanctions regime?
Senator, as you know well, over the last decade, we have sanctioned a number of financial institutions that have been facilitating trade with North Korea and holding responsible a number of people who have taken these actions. While we may not have taken sanctions under the act that's been passed, we do appreciate the authority that Congress has given us that will allow us in the future to do so. And as we find financial institutions that violate the law and facilitate this trade, we're committed to taking these actions.
Yeah, here's the issue. The issue is that it's not just authority in the Brink Act. It's a requirement. They're mandatory sanctions. And they're mandatory sanctions on any entities anywhere in the world that are facilitating the North Korean regime. So my question remains, and you can get back to me, because are you familiar with the UN reports that have been done where they actually identify by name entities around the world that are helping North Korea violate the sanctions regime? Are you aware of those reports?
Senator, I'm aware of those reports.
Okay. And have we looked at the reports, and have we concluded that they're wrong?
Senator, we haven't concluded that the reports are wrong. What we haven't done is found evidence is sufficient for the mandatory sanctions that are required under the Brink Act. But we look forward to continuing to look for that evidence and to working with you and your staff to use the mandatory sanctions that have been passed by Congress to hold North Korea accountable and to make sure that we're able to prevent them from advancing their weapons of mass destruction program.
Well, I appreciate that. The Appropriations Committee, we just released our appropriations bills for public review yesterday. I chair the FISG subcommittee, and we have language in there really directing the executive branch to provide us with an update, because we have, on the one hand, a UN report that identifies by name these entities, and yet we haven't seen any action. And if the reason is that we don't have sufficient evidence, we'd love to sit down with you and go over that. Thank you,
Senator,
Mr.
I'm happy
Chairman.
to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Howland. Senator Kramer from North Dakota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. Thank you, Ranking Member Toomey. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I want to follow up on a couple of things. First of all, both Senator Toomey and Senator Menendez and others, but especially the two of them, have certainly emphasized the expressions of commitment haven't led to action in terms of enforcing. And in the case of Nord Stream 2, where I want to drill down a little bit, certainly CATSA. And that's a pretty big problem, because you said something else about, I think it was to Senator Scott, about multilateral coordination is really important. Nord Stream 2 has been strongly opposed by the European Union Parliament. I mean, on 2 votes of like 400 to 100, and that's just rounding up the lower number and down the higher number. So it's hard for me to see much commitment when the president announces, just sort of out of the blue, the lifting of sanctions on Nord Stream 2, an authority he doesn't even have. And I think that we've concluded that the State Department determined that Nord Stream 2 Nord Stream 2 AG has facilitated sanctions evasion. On whose behalf? On whose behalf? I mean, who's the winner here? Why did the president lift the sanctions? Why are we facilitating this? I mean, on whose behalf is this being done?
So Senator, I appreciate the concerns and their concerns that we share. What we're doing within the Treasury Department is making sure that we're looking for any evidence that we can that will allow us to use the mandatory sanctions that current Congress provided to us. We've met on several occasions with members of the committee staff here to hear from them in terms of the evidence that they have. We've also worked closely with the Department of Justice to make sure that we have a good understanding of the legal authorities that we have in order to be in a place where we can take actions when we have the appropriate evidence.
But the president's actions were completely unilateral. They were outside of the law. And I want to know whose behalf was he doing? I mean, European Union or multinational relationship overwhelmingly opposed the completing of Nord Stream 2. And let me tell you a couple of good reasons why it's a bad idea in the first place, Nord Stream 2. Because it has natural gas produced in Russia, moved via pipeline like Nord Stream 2, besides captivating European allies to a single source, setting that aside for a moment, has through the life cycle of that gas a 41% higher greenhouse gas emission footprint than natural gas produced in the United States and liquefied and sent to the same European allies. And that doesn't even include the methane leakage. So what I'm trying to wrap my mind around is what's the good reason for lifting? And I know you're looking for every legal reason to enforce the law, which is interesting to me, but what's your theory, if you don't know, why the president would have done something like this?
Senator, we share your concerns with regard to the